Hello, everyone. We are going to get started in a couple minutes. So whether you are getting ready for the evening hours in the EU or the end of the day or lunch on the East Coast or in breakfast on the West, settle in and we're going to get started with what's going to be an amazingly fun, provocative, interesting, we hope, conversation. So we'll give you one more minute to get settled and then we'll get started at the top of the hour. It's fun to see some friends joining. So hello, Derek and Kent and Kristen. Great to see you here. We're getting started in about 1 minute. And if you would like to tell folks where you're coming in from today, please don't hesitate to use the chat and tell us where you're from. Tell us something that's making your day today as we get into connecting with each other at this time. Oh, Victoria, British Columbia, one of our favorite spots. Renee and I have both spent time in the Pacific Northwest and talked about Victoria in our warm-up call. All right, we have lots of folks coming in from the West Coast, just like Renee. She warned us it's first thing in the morning for her. All right, we are going to get started. So I'm Susan Hunt-Stevens, founder and CEO of WeSpire. Welcome to WeSpire Live, our monthly convening of our community and friends to talk about interesting and fascinating conversations at this intersection of people and work and climate and impact. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joined today by somebody whose work I respect immensely, learn from always, which is Renee Lertzman, who among many things is the founder of Project InsideOut. And we are here to talk a lot about our work in the field of culture and behavior change from the brand-led culture change conference here in Minneapolis. So there are hundreds of folks here today in Minneapolis. We're talking a lot about how we change human behavior at scale to be able to create a more inclusive and sustainable world. And it has been inspiring and fascinating and all of that, and perfectly timed for this conversation with Renee. Now, I always find it fascinating to hear how people ended up in the career they are in, especially in this space, especially when Renee and I have ended up in this same ecosystem from very different pasts. And so Renee, love for you to share your story with our attendees today.
Hi, thank you. It's really so good to see you. And I just want to share the mutual admiration of just feeling so inspired and impressed with what you've been doing, Susan, over these years, and really as a pioneer in an emerging space. So I am calling in from San Francisco Bay Area. I live south of San Francisco in the kind of woodsy Silicon Valley region. And actually, that's kind of where my story started. So I grew up not far from here in Palo Alto, California. And I think from an early age, I was very interested in humans and in psychology, but also in nature and the environment. And it really came together for me when I found myself at UC Santa Cruz, not far from here. And I was one of those, 18, 19-year-olds. I was actually feeling very clear, I'm going to be a psychologist because I had already been in therapy and benefited. And so I was pretty clear about that. But what happened was I found myself, I signed up for an elective on environmental studies, which, it doesn't come with a warning label to say, if you sign up for this class, it could turn your whole world upside down, because we're actually talking about the planet. So I signed up and I found myself going through this experience of sort of shock and confusion and disbelief, because I was toggling these worlds of psychology over here, human behavior, why are we the way we are? And then I was in these environmental studies classes about humans over a very short amount of time, a particular subset of humans, let's just say, have actually, irreparably changed our planet. And so we're going to talk about all the ways we've done that. We've polluted the water and the air and the soil, and we've led to species loss, and we've changed our atmosphere. So I went through that experience, and it led me very quickly to realize that I needed to fuse and join these fields, and that it was actually sort of weird and incoherent not to. And that was in the late 1980s. And so at the time, it was a very vibrant time, actually, for environmental thought. It was very, there was a lot of kind of sense making about what do we do about this, because if you keep in mind, the 70s is when it really came online. But by the late 80s, people were trying to reconcile with what do we do about this? And so I basically sort of charted a path. And so, like a lot of us, I defaulted to what is most natural for me, which is I'm a writer and I'm a communicator. And so I went the route of becoming basically a comms professional without really knowing that's what I was doing. But I ended up working, in a writing and researching. And so long story short, because it is kind of a long story, but I'll cut to the to the more kind of the real turning point for me was I ended up doing a PhD in the UK, where I, again, kind of brought together the psychological field with social science, with climate and the environment. And I did some in-depth research around, talking with people about why are we not engaging more. And I came up with this concept of the myth of apathy, that apathy is an absolute myth. Now, what happened is I came back, had a postdoc, and left academia because I realized that I really wanted to take all of this and put it into practice. And I wasn't that excited about writing research papers. And no slam to anyone who loves doing peer-reviewed research papers that take 3 years to publish. I was like, we don't have time for that. That's just me. And so I left, and within a few months, I was literally speaking at Sustainable Brands in 2011.
That's when we met. I know. So amazing. Well, and what's fascinating is that I find the same story in threads in so many different people. And I think, as we shared, if you had told me when I was 18 years old in 1988 that I was going to be, work in the environmental field and be considered an environmental activist, I would have been like, no way.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was the movement. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Environmentalists were really scary. They
Right.
were chaining themselves to trees and blowing things up and generally angry. And they did not seem like people that you would necessarily want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And, what it took me connecting after my on-ramp was more environmental health related with food allergies for my young son, but connecting with this amazing group of women online in the early blog days who
Mm-hmm.
were writing, basically, whether it was, around a plastic-free life, or, Robin O'Brien with unhealthy treats, just all these aspects of how these environmental challenges were affecting our everyday lives and what we were just trying to do about it. One of the women lead tested Thomas the Tank Engine trains, and it led to the, banning of bringing them in from China for many, many years because there was lead in the paint. And of course, kids chew on their trains.
Right.
But, that myth of apathy, I think, is so, so powerful. And you have 3 concepts that I'd love for you to explain to our attendees today that kind of tie into this. One is the window of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
And the next is the double bind. and then attunement. So, so let's start with the first one. What is the window of tolerance?
So the window of tolerance is actually a concept that Dr. Dan Siegel came up with. And Dan Siegel is like a number of us, including myself. He's a synthesizer, right? So he takes a lot of the evidence-based research out there and he brings it together into these models and frames that make it very easy to grasp. And so I invoke the window of tolerance as a reminder to anyone working in the climate, ESG, environment, sustainability space that the work we're doing, no matter what you think and how exciting and positive it is, it's also very emotionally charged and it's triggering in many ways for many kinds of people. So the window of tolerance is a framework that describes the way that each of us have a window of nervous system regulation, where on the one end, if we get overstimulated and overactivated, so maybe it's fear, anxiety, overwhelm, whatever, some of us can either go into a collapse, withdrawal, step away, disconnect, kind of numbing. So that's on one end of the spectrum of this window. And on the other side of the window is more of that aggression, hostility, acting out, that kind of energy that goes out. So there's the shutdown and then there's the energy going out. And what he talks about so brilliantly is what keeps us in the window, because we all want to be we want to stay within this window where we are productive, we're able to access our highest selves, the prefrontal cortex of strategy and empathy and imagination and foresight. But what's happening is the content itself can be such that it pushes us out of that window. And so anyone working in the space, in my view, needs to be really understanding and literate about this window and what keeps people in the zone. And what he found keeps us in the zone is attunement. So all these concepts are entirely related. So
Exactly.
What keeps people in the zone, what people find as clinicians, which is my primary source, is people who work with other people, is that what keeps us in the zone is feeling like we're connected. I'm not alone. You understand me. I feel heard. I'm witnessed. I'm seen. And so like in this conversation, there's a connection, right? There's a sense of we kind of are tuning into each other, even as we're having this conversation.
Yep.
If there's a lack of that, which the majority of climate people fall into, I'm sorry to say, when there's a lack of attunement, people are like really pushed out and can't even engage with the work. So it comes back to attunement. Relationship keeps us in that window of tolerance. Yep. So that's that concept. Shall I jump to the double bind now?
Yeah.
So the double,
I love the fact that when you explain the double bind, it the way I understood it is when you said damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I said, boy, does that apply not only
exactly
certainly in this world of climate and impact work, but I think it applies in a lot of places, startups and civic government and all those kinds of things. But let's talk about the double bind in this context.
So again, I think the concept of a double bind is baseline for anyone working in the space, because we have to appreciate that many of us experience ourselves pulled in a what feels like an irreconcilable conflict. Now, whether it is truly irreconcilable, that's a different story, because a lot of people in the space can see the way through. Can see, well, wait, there's a pathway through, just come with me and we can deal with this. But what's really happening is that people experience, I feel so pulled that I have no choice but to just kind of check out. And the concept of the double bind came from Gregory Bateson, who is considered to be really one of the founders of systems thinking. So Gregory Bateson, he really articulated a systems approach, right? And he described the double bind as a precursor for insanity, for schizophrenia, right? And so he made this provocative assertion that when children have parents who are mentally unwell, who are giving the kid mixed messages, it makes it more likely that the child will develop a form of psychosis. And so if you take that and apply that to our collective cultural social moment right now, I think it helps make sense why a lot of people literally feel kind of crazy. And the implication of this, again, is that if you are working in the space, it's vital that we understand this so that we can be more attuned. Was that the last concept?
Yeah, exactly.
So attunement is a clinical term that was generated, I think, primarily in the trauma world, but also it's used in neuroscience. And so if you pick up any book or textbook about social neurobiology, which is the field that people like Dan Siegel are situated in, or I love the work of Lisa, is it Barrett Feldman, neuroscientists who are doing a lot of translating for the general public. Attunement means in relationship, in a resonance, in a resonant way. So my ability to be attuned is to tune in and to be able to sense what might be going on with the other. And again, what's really important here is attunement is the basic building block of a relationship. And knowing that you're at the conference and that, a lot of people tuning in, no pun intended, might be working in the brand space and in, agencies and business, it's really important to remember that attunement is not just the one-on-one here. You can design a profoundly attuned campaign. You can design a profoundly attuned leadership message. And we see some evidence of that coming out more and more, where leaders and campaigns are starting to be more nuanced with the ability to say, we see you, we get you, we understand you, we are with you, and we're not going to just push happy, clappy solutioneering on you without also acknowledging that you might be feeling some double bind and you might be feeling that, outside of your window of tolerance. So that to me is next level work in the space.
I think it's also, using an example that you gave, it's next level leadership, because one of the things that you explained is an attuned leader wouldn't say, here's 10 things for you to go do, that's going to solve the problem, or that's how we're going to hit our goals. They would say, I'm scared too. I don't have all the answers. We are in this together, but we can do this. That is a very different message that I think most leaders would say, because we're not taught as leaders to say, I'm scared too.
No. And so the more people can do that, and that's why I often reference my client and colleague, Michael Bacher at Google, who's a VP of Global Workplace Programs. I really admire the way that he comes out openly and says, you know what, like sustainability is not my background. And here I am having to suddenly deal with, this incredibly complex technical realm. I don't know, and so I feel like we need to elevate leaders who are doing it to basically say, hey, you know what, not only is it okay to do it, but this is what gains trust. This is what builds attunement between you and your team, your colleagues, the broader sector out there. So I 100% agree. And I was just flashing back when you just said that. I remember watching a State of the Union address, and I think I tweeted, like, immediately like, here's a fantasy of what a president would say. And it's exactly what you just said.
Yeah. And it just, and I think it takes a lot of courage. And that's a word I
Yes.
use a lot right now in what makes a great leader. I think we are in a time that requires so much courage from
Mhm.
leaders, and courage to say, I don't have all the answers and I'm scared too. Whatever,
Yeah.
on several topics, not just this one. So
Before
you
you
have
jump
done,
ahead, though, before you jump
pardon?
ahead, I just want to acknowledge the word courage is so beautiful, because the root of the word courage is heart.
Yeah.
And I want to bring us back to the fact that what we're talking about is inside job too. So it's I think we're at a moment where, as practitioners, we're starting to realize that we have to do some inner work and resource ourselves in a whole variety of ways to access that courage, the heart, to push through what might feel like real edges.
Yeah. And that this work can be exhausting,
Mhm.
and so I think we've also recognized, and it's one of the reasons that I think conferences like Sustainable Brands and Green Biz and other things do, of course, there's a whole set of programming that's around the education and the connection and all of that. But I really do think it's also the community that is built, because it's what recharges your batteries. Because, we work with people who, are charged with huge goals, very small budgets and resources, large workforces,
Mhm.
and who are often either in a 1, 2, 3-person team.
Right.
And so they don't have the internal community or collaboration
Right.
that
Right.
supports their efforts, and
Right.
often are getting fighting from lots of people against their efforts, because their efforts are requiring change or data they don't have, or things like that. And so finding that community to build that resilience is such an important part of being able to have the energy to keep doing this work.
Right. And this is why I feel very strongly that organizations need to step more into a role of being a convener, which is reflected in the Project Inside Out work, which is, what does it mean to be a guide? Well, a guide convenes people, a
Mhm.
guide holds space. And so I feel like any kind of convener platform, Sustainable Brands, there's all these communities, there's TED and there's Aspen and there's this and that. Their role and job right now is to lean into providing these rich spaces for connection that develop us. There's not just about the content anymore.
Right.
It's about really development of who we are as humans, as leaders and practitioners. And it's why pretty much all I do at this point is creating programs that are based on cohorts,
Yes.
right? Because we learn and process in relationship. And so, that's the engine of transformation and culture change, is basically, if I were to just say one thing you could do, create a cohort model where you meet in cohorts for a year and people are vulnerable with each other. It's not, doesn't have to be high tech.
Right. Right. And so you just mentioned Project Inside Out and the work you're doing. Why don't you give everybody just a sort of the elevator description of Project Inside Out and what it is, but then tell us about the 5 guiding principles, because I love them. I think they
Oh, thank
are
you.
great principles for any work that's being done. And it had such great language, like be a gardener and grow your people, So why don't you just, so folks have context for what you're doing with Project Inside Out. Tell us just a little bit about that in concept, and then the 5 guiding principles and how those came about.
Okay, thank you. So Project Inside Out came about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was approached by a foundation in Denmark to imagine a dream project. And at the time I was consulting, thanks to my work with communities like Sustainable Brands, doing really cool work with business. But I was realizing that I needed some actual frameworks and tools that someone who's working on the front lines of change can just start to use. But also, so the elevator pitch is, these are tools and resources grounded in psychological research and evidence-based work when it comes to human behavior change. But I don't use the term behavior change because this is really about really about transformation. And so everything so we rapidly started iterating and piloting and putting some stuff together. I pulled together my favorite climate psychologists and some strategists and some trainers in the motivational interviewing world, which is a whole body of work in the public health sector that I'm really tapping into. And I have produced this hub. And right now we're starting to pilot some learning journeys and ways of bringing this to life with teams and organizations. So that's Project InsideOut. The premise of Project InsideOut, frankly, is it's an intervention, but I don't say that openly. It used to be called clinical interventions, and that's not very sexy. So we called it Project InsideOut, which is it's a way to invite change makers into a journey where we reflect on our theories of change and we shift the orientation away from I'm the educator, I'm the cheerleader, I'm the writer, the activist, to what does it mean to be a guide for change? And that language of guiding comes directly out of motivational interviewing. So I did not make it up. I've stolen it. And motivational interviewing is open source, so they're cool with it. And so I basically brought in this theme of how do we move from writing people, this is why we have to do it because it's the right thing to do, to guiding people, which is really starts with inquiry. Like, who are you? Where are you? What's your world? Here's what's happening. Would you like to come along? And so it's a different orientation, and it's an inner orientation, but it's also very, very applied. And so that's the premise of Project InsideOut. So we have some simple tools where you can have some reflection on what my theories of change are. And then you ideally go through those guiding principles. So I'm really excited that you mentioned that because I'm very proud of this work. I think those guiding principles are super robust, and it's a bit of a playbook. And so the 5 principles that we offer, that if you do all of these, you will put into practice exactly what we're talking about. So attuning is number 1. So attune to your people. And that relates, and I know this is a space you really occupy, Susan, is and I experience you as very attuned, by the way. We start with attunement, which references insight work. So we all need insights into who we're working with, but we're proposing that we update our approach to insights because a lot of insight work is very superficial and not very accurate. So this is where I'm being provocative. The very first session at Sustainable Brands in 2011, I was on the Insights Roundtable with an incredible array of colleagues. And I was like, you know what? Our insights are really not that good. And then I wondered why no one wanted to collaborate. Anyway, I've evolved since then. But I basically am trying to say that what we want to understand people's anxieties, which often aren't conscious. So you're not going to always get it from a survey. We want to understand people's ambivalence, where they're pulled into different directions and feel stuck. Again, it's a skill to learn how to listen for the ambivalence. And we want to know the aspiration. And so a lot of the work that we do, it's very values oriented, it's very belief oriented, it's very attitudinal. And that's all okay, but it doesn't get at what's really the attunement that we need to stay in that window of tolerance. So that's attune. So it's very practical, but it's also a mindset. Mm-hmm. And then there's a reveal, which is communication. So this is the comms. How do we communicate through the lens of attunement, right? So that's tell the hard stuff. So people ask me all around the world, like, well, how do we talk to this stuff about people? Because it's so triggering and people get so overwhelmed. Well, It's not about whether you talk about what's actually going on. I would never suggest we don't name and talk about what's going on, but we have to do it in a skillful, emotionally intelligent way. So that's the concept of reveal. Reveal is reveal, like what's happening. And then the third is equip. Equip is what you do really well, which is give people tools, give people resources so that they can be effective in their realm. And the really important intervention here is a lot of experts in the SDG, ESG, SDG space, they unconsciously feel like it's all on them. And I have to drive the change. I have to go into a room full of a board and I have to say, okay, this, and equip is a total reframe. It's like, hey, if you're a sustainability team in a large multinational company, your responsibility is to equip and enable your stakeholders and your employees. It's no longer, oh, this is ours and we're going to push campaigns out at people. It's actually, we're going to host some labs and workshops and we're going to enable you and we're going to equip you. So that's the third. The fourth is convening. So I mentioned this earlier that the most powerful thing we can do is to be a convener. And I think every brand needs to see themselves as a convener right now. And so you can take that in a number of ways, creative ways, but the tagline is stop talking at people, foster productive interactions. And that means create space for interactions. If you're designing an offsite, if you're designing a retreat, if you're designing a all hands, make sure you have the opportunity for people to do some meaningful interaction. And then the fifth is sustain, which is the intervention is go beyond the pledge, beyond the goal, beyond the target, beyond the campaign mindset, because I've just seen this over and over again where all the energy is focused on the target and the pledge, but it's not on sustaining for the long haul. Right? It's not on building the momentum and the flywheel. And so sustain really is kind of reflects if you're doing all of those other well, then you are going to sustain the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the observation that we see as well, and we talk about this, in fact, our head of customer success has this great analogy that he tries to explain to customers. And he said, you need to stop thinking about your employee engagement efforts as a space launch where you have to get everything right. And all on one day, you have liftoff and takeoff, and you don't. You need to think about it as a soccer team, that you're putting together and you're putting out on the field and you're going to see how it goes. And then you're going to make some adjustments and then you're going to go back out on the field and then you're going to make some adjustments. You're going to go back on the field and you're going to play every day, every year, all day long, trying to get better and better and better, and because what we see is so much energy goes into launch and not enough resources, mind share, calm space sustains.
Right.
And people wonder why it doesn't work because that's not how change works. Change takes time. It can take years to get attuned to where people are, to support and equip them in order to have it be effective. And too many organizations, focus on the launch and they don't focus on sustain.
Yeah, that's 100% what sustain principle is getting at.
Yeah.
And it's also so a lot of what we do are themselves strategies to manage our anxiety and high stakes and urgency. And that leads to a lot of activation all over the place. And what I'm saying is we need to invoke more mindfulness and a little bit more of a pause, but that doesn't mean slowing down. And it doesn't mean that what we're talking about takes, like often people misinterpret what I'm saying as we don't have time for that. Well, I don't know about you, but I've seen people radically change in a profound way if they have literally an hour to have an in-depth conversation with someone and it might spark something. So there, it's a complete myth that it takes lots and lots of time to have conversations and talk, when in actuality, humans change very quickly. When we are attuned, we feel supported, we feel we have agency, we have access to tools and resources. When those conditions are optimal, we can shift very quickly. And so I think that's just a really important piece to land.
And it actually picks up on something that Solitaire Townsend from Futera did in her keynote here, which she talked about one of the it turned out to be inaccurate assumptions for how change was going to work in the climate movement. And she harkened back to the work 30 years ago that they started doing at the COPs, and assuming that climate action would follow a straight line. And in fact, it has not. And if you kind of look at where we are compared to where people thought we'd be, we're nowhere near where we thought to be. But when you start to peel back the layers, what you realize is most profound changes are exponential, and they're very slow until they hit this tipping point. And then she showed these slides of all these different aspects of sustainability that have hit these inflection points very recently. And what was inspiring and aspirational, I think, for folks here was, she said, based on where we are in these hockey sticks, the next 7 years, 8 years are going to be so exciting, because the pace of change, the rate of change, to your point, when you give it time, when you put the conditions, can be dramatic. And it doesn't make it easier, but it is, it can be encouraging to know that all this hard work is going to start to create the conditions for more exponential change.
Right. And this is exactly why I reference what works really well in psychodynamic settings.
Oh, tell me what a psychodynamic setting is.
Well, it's when you're working with a psychotherapist or you're doing group work, but a really skillful therapist or counselor or practitioner, social worker will tell you and give you a heads up of what to anticipate so that you can mentally prepare and orient. They will say to you, guess what? We're on a journey, and there's going to be times when you might feel really hopeless and that there's no way that anything is going to change. And I want to let you know that is to be expected. And I'm right here with you, and just know that change does happen in all kinds of mysterious and sometimes very quickly, and sometimes it feels really slow. Now, that ability to articulate what you just said, basically like what Solly did, is to orient us to change, is huge. It's huge, which is why I refer to what I do as existential change management. Like, that's my tagline now. Because
that's awesome. That's a great tagline.
I didn't even know the field of change management existed until I started working with business. And I was like, oh, that's what they call human development and change. That's interesting.
Transformation.
Right, exactly. And what I've really appreciated bringing in all this incredible change management work from, like, I'm very inspired by adaptive leadership, Ron Heitfitz, Otto Scharmer, Peter Senge, Jennifer Garvey Berger, Amy Edmondson. What I love about that work is it provides, again, it sort of raises our awareness about the realm of change and how change happens. And so it takes away that element of surprise or like, I'm feeling so defeated. It basically, in the adaptive leadership world, they call it getting on the balcony. And I love that concept of like, okay, now let's get up on the balcony here and look down and kind of assess what's going on from a change management perspective. Are we in the zone of productive discomfort? Are we, outside of that?
Yeah.
But just having that landscape is really powerful. Like, just hearing you describe that in the 7 years, it immediately has an impact on me. And it makes me feel calmer, frankly, because I feel like, okay, like, that helps me make sense of why my practice is exploding and how I can think about this from the lens of like, this is a long haul. Like, this is not all right now, immediately. you know, and then it helps us be more resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one last question for you, and then we have some questions starting to come in from the audience. If you had not had a chance to put in your Q&A, please go ahead and start adding those questions in now, and we'll get to them. But one of the frameworks that I loved that you talk about is the 4 quadrants. And I think all of us live in organizations where things have to get done, but it takes the 4 quadrants kind of to make them happen. So could you explain, in, you know, for the work you do with organizations, how you think about the 4 quadrants in this context?
Sure. So the 4 quadrants were, it's a map of the very dominant theories of change or approaches to change that are very alive in our space. And so you can look at this quadrant. It's on projectinsideout.net. It's also on my own website. It can be read as a development of like how the field has evolved. And it can also be looked at as a map for organizations and teams to assess where they are. So, and I want to acknowledge that I pulled this together when I was commissioned by Skoll Foundation, asked me to do some landscaping on engagement. Like how, you know, what's the landscape review? And in a way, I kind of I decided as I was doing the research, I was like, wow, there are these 4 kind of modes that are so active and they're kind of siloed. And so we start with behavior change, meaning the lens of behavioral economics and behavioral science, and how a lot of people don't know that the field of climate psychology, the origins of it really came out of behavioral science and risk psychologists and decision making, and you know, that whole world of you know, Kahneman, and you know, so that's the lens of how do we change people's behavior by incentives, by nudge theory, by choice architecture, rewards, gamification. That's the
We don't know anything about any of that at WeSpire.
No. No, it's this really potent, really powerful kind of arsenal, right? And then you've got messaging and framing and storytelling, and that's this whole kind of fixation on what's the narrative, what's the story, what's the framing, the language, the terminology we're using. Should we say climate change or should we say this? And how do we speak to people's values and their beliefs? And so that really started exploding, I would say mid to late 1990s. So the behavior is happening, and then you've got the framing and messaging coming on. And then we've got design thinking and using the methodologies that come out of IDOU and come out of tech sector. Let's unleash design thinking on the world. So that's social impact, Ashoka, accelerators, labs, incubators. So if you hear that language, an accelerator, or a hackathon, or that literally comes out of the design space. And then we've got the 4th quadrant is what I call experiential. And that's really about relationality. You know, we're starting to see more cohorts and cafes and emotional intelligence and inner development goals. And so those are these 4. And so they kind of are in a way chronological, in that the experiential realm has been building over the time I've been in the space. And I was one of the early people to kind of say, we need to talk about this. And now it's completely exploded. But what we're needing and what's happening now is an integration. So we want to see integration, but the way that you can use this is you can at least start with a self-awareness. Say, oh, wow, like, yeah, I went through this program. I went through this training. I did that master's program, and we were really encouraged to think about it this way, but I see I'm missing this piece here, which is the psychological or the trauma or the inclusion or the diversity or the, like, we're starting to have this moment of integrating, and it does require some courage, because no one wants to look at their theory of change and question it. Like I don't, it's extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So we need to kind of approach this very gently, but also really with this mindset of this is what it takes to be next level, is that you've got to be really have acuity and literacy about your theory of change, and know where you are in that quadrant.
Yeah.
So it's a very powerful framework that, and you can use it as a team activity. You can do mapping, you can, all kinds of things, but the takeaway is integration. It's not that one is more important or better than the other.
It's a yes and you could find that you might be doing something really well in the area of messaging, but be way behind in the area of systems.
But the other thing is that it's like ingredients.
Yeah.
A recipe. Sometimes you really do need to have primarily a messaging approach.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to develop an app that's primarily behavioral. So it really depends on what you're going for, the scale, the speed, the velocity, the culture. So you're thinking about all these variables. It's not like, oh, I have to now launch a conversation-based platform in my multinational. I think everyone should, but it doesn't mean that it's like a one-size-fits-all situation.
Totally.
And so my fantasy is that more and more organizations, agencies, practitioners develop literacy so that they can kind of come in and be like, okay, like I'm hearing that this is very BSI, and I'm sensing that we have an opportunity to bring in conversations because people are feeling overwhelmed. Like that's the kind of level of skill that's needed, I think.
Absolutely. So one of the questions from the audience is, for someone who doesn't have a psychology background, how would you suggest they enter this sustainable transformation practitioner space? How much of it is applying concepts to their current sustainability work? Are there PhD programs or certifications or relevant paths? What if somebody wants to get better at this personally?
Well, it's very still emerging space, but more and more training programs are starting to come online. My biggest recommendation is partner, collaborate, bring in, if my sense is there's usually some people in one's community or realm that have training in it might be group process work, it might be as a facilitator, trauma. Invite them and suggest that you collaborate and partner. This is a realm of innovation. We should all be innovating. I want to see more psychologists at events like yours. There should be a quarter of the population there should be coming from the human sciences, because this is human work. So we need to push ourselves to reach out and expand to include ethnographers, anthropologists, psychologists, therapists, trauma specialists, counselors, social workers. I just gave a keynote to the American Social Work Association. It was like a big social work association, and they were like, we don't know how we can contribute to the space and if we're relevant. And my response is, I'm dumbfounded. It's like, do you not realize that you literally have access to skills and tools that the movement needs right now? Like they don't see it yet. The professionals are still very focused on the human interpersonal world, but more and more people are wanting to have impact beyond that. And so if more organizations can invite them in, or if you are a psychologist, then reach out. But I'm speaking to the question of how do I foray into this? It's just like any other policy. I mean, it's sort of like, hey, I don't have a background in policy, but how do I be a successful practitioner? Well, you go to your program and you say, you need to have this, you need to offer this, right? Like it has to be core curriculum.
Yeah.
So it's about kind of diversifying the teams and the resources we have.
Yeah. There's another question that came in, which is, where and what work do you see that gets you most excited? Who do you think is doing really interesting work in the space, either as a brand or as a civic organization or as a governmental organization? Who do you think is kind of pioneering and one to watch?
That's a good question. I guess I would say, so I have a recency bias because of some of the people I work with. So, but that doesn't mean that I'm saying they're the only ones, or it's only because I'm working with them. So just to be clear.
Absolutely.
IKEA has been really interesting. IKEA was one of the first companies to join the Inner Development Goals work. This is a new movement that's emerging out of Sweden. And they have been they're very mindful and thoughtful about their culture now. You know, all organizations are going through major change right now, and their cultures are changing. We all know that. So I'm speaking kind of generally, not at this, you know, but generally, I've been really interested and impressed with IKEA, and I just did a program with them where I got to know them more, and I was really struck by their ability to embrace looking at the inner and the outer dimensions of leadership and sustainability. And I want to shout out to Shauna Sadowski, who is also in this community and someone who initiated that. And then the other, I'm trying to think of, this is very like just popping into my head. It's very free association style, but I'm thinking about years ago, there was a campaign from the energy company called Ørsted in Denmark. It was so brilliant. It was very emotionally, cognitively, and behaviorally attuned, where they had people, they were able to go into the space of positioning themselves as leaders, but they did it in a way where it was very rich with narrative and with personal story, and it was very intimate. And it really dialed into how climate is deeply, deeply intimate. Like it took us into the domicile, you know, into like the family unit with like babies and families and the home, but it zoomed out to the big macro, like here we are in this like crazy global situation. And so it kind of like the way it moved between that, I was really impressed. So there's not that many examples right now. So I guess I would reframe the question as we got to create more examples of how companies, businesses are showing more attunement.
Yeah. And I think that is a step that gets skipped a lot. I think the temptation for marketers, and I say this as a recovering chief marketing officer, you know, is to go for the action and the response and to get you to do the thing, click the thing, buy the thing, share the thing, you know, all of that, because that's what we get measured on.
Yes.
You know, forgetting that sometimes the most effective way of getting that thing to happen later is to show that attunement to start.
Exactly.
And there was a woman presenting here who you can Lola, and she has this hashtag responsible marketing, and she showed what she does is she follows brands that are doing kind of campaigns that are trying to connect with Black consumers, particularly Black women. And she showed examples that were just really highly effective from brands. And she showed examples that were just terrible from brands. But what strikes me connecting and bridging her presentation with your work is the brands that really connected with her had that attunement.
Yes.
And what the mistakes showed was one, either a total lack of attunement or failure to be courageous when a vocal minority, it was outside their window of tolerance, shall we say, and had a backlash, and they didn't stay courageous. And so then nobody was happy, and she happened to bring up Bud Light in the context of even though it wasn't necessarily her core topic, she said, I think we can all see what's happening with Bud Light and know that that was a miss on so many fronts,
Right.
but not just a lack of attunement around one aspect, but also a failure to be courageous on the other.
So I love that you just connected those two dimensions of being attuned and courageous. It takes courage to be attuned.
Yeah. Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage. It's not comfortable.
Yeah.
To attune is to be more vulnerable, to take more risks, to be more edgy, to step out. So you just put that together for me in a way that I never really thought of before, that it really, that is the fail, is if we aren't able to do that. And this goes back to the real work of attunement has to be on the inside. You can't expect people to just, okay, now be attuned. It actually takes the conditions in an organization that support people to have the safety to go in and really check in. Like, where am I? How am I feeling? In order to surface the blind spots, because unless you do that work, you are literally communicating to the world your unconscious. You are literally broadcasting your unconscious anxieties in a very unproductive way. And then what happens is it has that, unfortunately, kind of a trauma response. It's like unprocessed trauma. And what we're doing unintentionally is we're leaking that out. And then we're triggering other people's trauma. Right. And so that's why I said, I remember in my TED Talk when I said, I don't think I planned on saying it until I was on stage, where I was like, there's no bypass here. There's no way around having to do the inner work in order to show up as a really, with integrity, with like resilience, with attunement. Like, it's an inner outer thing. It's not like I'm saying, oh, everyone go off on a retreat or get into psychotherapy. I'm just simply saying who we are as humans, like that informs what we do in the world, which does bring us back to you.
Oh, oh boy.
Because I'm really intrigued with how you have evolved and developed, because you as a leader would not be able to do the work you're doing and have the business you have and grow it the way you have unless you as a human being are also doing something right. So
we'll let you call Mr. Stevens and see if he agrees.
we're all a work in progress.
Yeah, we are. Well, and I think that is what I can tell you, that the benefit of maturing, aging, growing has been an acknowledgement that being human, for the good, for the bad, the part that works, the part that doesn't, acknowledging there's days I'm a good leader, acknowledging there's days I'm a terrible leader. If I just show up that way, it's far better than trying to do it how I did in my 30s, which was trying to think I needed to have all the answers and be perfect.
Exactly.
Because that's not sustainable. Not only that, it wasn't even remotely true. So, but I think there is something about growing up, and just having more experience. And I think also, when I think about informative things that happen as leaders, I have led an organization through 9/11. I have led, and we failed in the context of 9/11. I worked in an industry that does such important work, journalism. during the most tumultuous economic turmoil of the '08 crash and things like that, and then startup in all the crazy roller coaster ways. I think that the tip was when the bank failed. It was like, all right, but that's when you go through hard times, I
Yeah.
think it makes you able to tune with others who are going through.
Yes, absolutely. There's the
Absolutely.
maturity, the experience, but there's the openness and willingness to learn and grow.
Yes.
And something I've learned again, from some of my favorite clients like Michael Bacher is the beauty and power of having a genuine learning mindset or growth mindset is kind of rare because it takes there's a certain kind of humility to receive. Like I like to say, feedback is a gift.
Me
It
too.
doesn't always feel good.
It doesn't always feel good. It isn't
right, but life is
gift.
giving us feedback
Yeah,
constantly.
totally.
And so how do we adapt? How do we take it in?
Yeah.
Ideally, that is what happens as we evolve and mature as leaders.
Yeah. Well, and I have found as a leader that, hiring and looking for people with a learning mindset has been one of the key ways that a small company can bat over its size in terms of
Mhm.
impact, is if everyone working with you has that learning mindset as well.
Exactly.
And that adaptive mindset as well. And
And
things
that
like that.
goes to the psychological safety topic we discussed earlier.
Oh, absolutely. We could have a whole different webinar with Amy Edmondson on psychological safety. Would be
Yeah,
amazing.
that would
Things
be
like that.
amazing.
Well, we are at time. I hope that for all of you who were with us today, you feel like you got a jolt of both learning new, really important leading concepts that are critical not only to the work we're doing in this world, but I think to ourselves as the people doing this work in the world. Renee, you are amazing. And I hope everybody goes to Project InsideOut and becomes part of these communities and continues to learn from you. I know we'll continue to collaborate in some really, really fun ways in the future. And for those of you who have not had a chance and missed our webinar last month on the State of Employee Engagement 2023, Adam will put the link. Please go there. There's a ton of information in around psychological safety. We really put a lot of research into it and are pretty excited about what we found. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to head back to brand-led culture change. And thank you all for joining. And thanks again, Renee, for your time and your insights as always.
Thanks for having me. It's great talking with you.
Bye, everyone.